The shopping cart hit my hip with enough force to make me stumble. I turned around, ready to accept an apology that never came. Instead, I found a woman staring at my wrinkled shirt and old sneakers with disgust. Her words cut through the supermarket aisle like a blade, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. She wanted me to know I was in her way, that I looked like someone who had nothing better to do while she, according to her, company badge swinging from her neck, was a busy professional. I said nothing. I just read her name on that badge and walked away. What she did not know was that my silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Sometimes the quietest response becomes the loudest lesson. This is the story of how one moment of humiliation led to a Monday morning no one in that company would forget. If you or someone in your family has also experienced this, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you are listening to this story from. We will post new stories every day. The fluorescent lights in the Harris Teeter supermarket on Providence Road buzzed overhead as I pushed through the automatic doors at 7:30 on a Friday evening. My body felt heavy, like I was carrying invisible weights on my shoulders. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of conference calls that stretched past midnight, financial reports that needed my signature before dawn, and flights between Charlotte and our regional offices that left me sleeping in airport lounges more than in my own bed. I had not told anyone about the promotion yet. The official announcement was scheduled for Monday morning. Until then, I was just Dorothy Mitchell, a face people passed in the hallway without a second glance, was not dressed for attention. My gray sweatshirt had a small coffee stain near the collar that I had not bothered to treat. My jeans were faded at the knees. My sneakers were the same pair I had worn for weekend errands for the past 2 years. I had pulled my hair into a simple ponytail without looking in a mirror. Makeup seemed pointless when all I wanted was a large coffee from the store's cafe section, and then the sanctuary of my apartment where I could finally sleep for more than 4 hours straight. The store was moderately busy for a Friday evening. Shopping carts rolled past me as I made my way toward the back corner where the small cafe counter sat. I noticed a woman in her mid-30s standing near the dairy section, talking loudly on her phone. Her voice carried across the aisle, sharp and impatient. She wore a crisp white blouse and black slacks, and a company badge dangled from a lanyard around her neck. I recognized the logo immediately. It was the same company where I had worked for the past 11 years, though our headquarters building was large enough that I did not know every face. I walked past her, my mind still half focused on the presentation slides I had reviewed that morning. I was thinking about the restructuring plan, about the 3 departments that would merge under new leadership, about the people whose jobs would change, and the conversations I would need to have with each of them. I was thinking about how to be fair, how to be firm, how to make decisions that would hurt in the short term, but help in the long run. I did not see her cart coming. The metal corner slammed into my right hip with enough force to knock me off balance. I grabbed the shelf beside me to steady myself, my hand landing on a row of cereal boxes that rattled from the impact. Pain shot through my hip and down my leg. I took a breath and turned around, expecting to hear an apology, maybe even see some concern on the person's face. Instead, I found her staring at me with an expression that made my stomach tighten. Her eyes traveled from my worn sneakers up to my stained sweatshirt, then to my face. The look she gave me was not one of accident or embarrassment. It was, contempt. "Watch where you are standing," she said. Her voice was loud, deliberate. She wanted others to hear. Some of us actually work for a living and do not have time to wander around blocking the aisles. I felt heat rise to my face. Around us, other shoppers had stopped. A man with a basket full of frozen dinners stood frozen 3 feet away. An elderly couple near the bread section turned to look. A young mother with a toddler in her cart slowed down to watch. I opened my mouth to respond, but something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the shock of being treated like I was invisible, like I was less than human just because of how I looked at that moment. I had spent the last 3 weeks proving my worth in boardrooms and strategy meetings. I had earned respect through years of dedication and results, and here, in a grocery store aisle, none of that mattered to this woman because she could not see past my appearance. I said, "Move," she continued, louder now. She gestured with her hand like she was shooing away a stray animal. "People who have real jobs need to get their shopping done." She lifted her badge with her other hand, making sure I saw it, making sure everyone saw it. The company name was printed clearly across the plastic card. Below it, her name, Jessica Hartman. Her photo showed her smiling professionally, the kind of smile people practice for corporate headshots. I looked at that badge for 3 seconds. I memorized the name. I noted the employee number printed in small digits at the bottom. Then I looked back at her face. She was waiting for me to argue, to defend myself, to give her a reason to escalate this moment into something even more humiliating. But I did not give her all that satisfaction. Instead, I stepped aside. I moved my body to the left, creating a clear path for her cart. I did not say a word. I did not apologize for existing in a space I had every right to occupy. I just moved, and I watched her push her cart past me with a triumphant smirk on her face. She walked away like she had won something, like she had put me in my place, like she had reminded me of some hierarchy she believed existed in. The world where people in business clothes mattered more than people in sweatshirts. The other shoppers slowly returned to their own tasks. The man with the frozen dinners shook his head and continued down the aisle. The elderly couple exchanged a look that seemed to say they had seen enough cruelty for one day. The young mother whispered something to her toddler and turned her cart in the opposite direction. I stood there for a moment, longer, my hips still throbbing from where the cart had hit me. Then I walked toward the cafe counter. My hands were shaking slightly as I ordered my coffee. The barista, a young man with kind eyes, seemed to sense something was wrong. He did not ask questions. He just made my drink and handed it to me with a gentle smile. I took the coffee and left the store. I did not buy anything else. I just wanted to leave. In my car, I sat in the parking lot with the engine off. The coffee grew lukewarm in the cup holder beside me. I stared at the steering wheel and replayed the moment in my head. I thought about Jessica Hartman's face. I thought about the way she had looked at me like I was worthless. I thought about how easily she had decided my value based on nothing but my clothes and the fact that I was standing in her way. But I also thought about Monday. I thought about the meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. I thought about the conference room on the 8th floor, where department heads and senior staff would gather. I thought about the announcement that would be made, the announcement that would change the structure of 3 departments, including the one where Jessica Hartman worked. I did not plan revenge. That was not who I was. But I did make a decision as I sat in that parking lot. I decided that I would not let this moment pass without meaning. I decided that I would not allow someone who treated people with such disrespect to continue unchecked, not in a company where I now had the authority to examine conduct and performance, not in a workplace where I was about to become responsible for setting the tone and the culture. I started my car and drove home. That night, I did not sleep as much as I had hoped. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. I logged into the company's internal system using my new executive access credentials. I searched for Jessica Hartman's employee file. What I found did not surprise me, but it did confirm what I needed to know. Her performance reviews over the past 18 months showed a pattern. She met her sales targets, but her peer feedback scores were consistently low. Multiple colleagues had reported incidents of dismissive behavior and unprofessional conduct. One report described her as condescending toward support staff. Another mentioned that she had publicly criticized a coworker's presentation in a meeting, using language that was unnecessarily harsh. A third report noted that she had been warned twice about her tone in client emails. None of these incidents had been severe enough on their own to warrant serious disciplinary action. But, together, they painted a picture of someone who believed her position gave her permission to treat others poorly. They showed a pattern of behavior that the company had tolerated because she brought in revenue, because she was good at her job in the narrowest sense, because no one had bothered to hold her accountable for how she achieved her results. I read every document in her file. I made notes. I cross-referenced company policies on workplace conduct and professional behavior. I reviewed the guidelines for the new leadership structure that would take effect on Monday, and I realized that this situation was bigger than one moment in a grocery store. It was about the kind of environment we were creating, about whether we valued people only for their output, or also for how they treated each other along the way. By the time I closed my laptop, it was nearly 2 a.m. I finally went to bed, and this time I slept. I slept knowing that Monday would bring clarity, not revenge, not personal vindication, just clarity about what kind of leader I intended to be, and what kind of workplace I intended to help build. When I woke up on Saturday morning, my hip was bruised. A dark purple mark had spread across the skin where the cart had struck me. I pressed my fingers against it gently and felt the tenderness beneath. It would fade in a week or so, but the memory of that moment would stay with me longer. Not as a wound, but as a reminder that how we treat people when we think they do not matter is the truest measure of our character. I spent the weekend preparing. I reviewed the transition plan for the departments that would come under my oversight. I studied the organizational charts. I read personnel files for key team members. I made sure I understood not just the numbers and the strategies, but the people, their strengths, their challenges, their potential. And I thought about Jessica Hartman. I thought about the conversation we would need to have. I thought about how to handle it professionally, how to separate my personal feelings from my professional responsibilities, how to be fair, even when fairness felt difficult. By Sunday evening, I was ready. I laid out my clothes for Monday. I chose a navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and the pearl earrings my mother had given me when I earned my first management position. I polished my shoes. I prepared my notes for the morning meeting. I set my alarm for 5:30, so I would have time to review everything one more time before heading to the office. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt calm. I felt clear. I felt like someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and was ready to do it. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that matched the mood of early March in Charlotte. I drove to the headquarters building on College Street and parked in the executive garage. The elevator took me to the 8th floor where the main conference room waited. I arrived 40 minutes early. I wanted time to set up, to arrange my materials, to center myself before others arrived. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The long table could seat 20 people. I took my position at the head of the table and spread out my folders. The transition plan, the organizational charts, the performance reviews I had studied over the weekend. Everything I needed was right there in front of me. At 8:45, people started arriving. Department heads, senior managers, team leads. They filled the seats around the table, some chatting quietly, others checking their phones. I greeted each person as they entered. Some knew me well. Others had only met me in passing. A few looked surprised to see me sitting at the head of the table, but they said nothing. At 8:58, Jessica Hartman walked in. She was dressed impeccably. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her makeup was flawless. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the same company badge that had swung from her neck on Friday evening. She walked with confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was talking to another manager, laughing about something, completely at ease. Then she looked up and saw me. Her face changed. The smile disappeared. Her steps slowed. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her features, followed quickly by recognition. She knew who I was now. Or rather, she was starting to understand what Friday evening had really meant. I did not smile. I did not glare. I simply met her eyes and held them for 2 seconds before looking back down at my notes. It was enough. It was exactly enough. She took a seat near the middle of the table, as far from me as possible. The confidence she had carried into the room had evaporated. She set down her portfolio with hands that were no longer quite steady. She did not look at me again, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her pen a little too tightly. At 9 o'clock exactly, I stood up and began the meeting. The room fell silent when I stood. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some curious, some cautious, a few already knowing what was about to unfold. I pressed my hands flat against the polished table and took a breath before speaking. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on time. I know many of you have questions about why this meeting was called with such short notice. Some of you know me well. Others may have only seen me in passing over the years. My name is Dorothy Mitchell, and as of this morning, I am officially your new Senior Vice President of Regional Operations. The announcement landed with mixed reactions. A few people nodded, clearly already informed. Others exchanged glances of surprise. I saw one manager lean back in his chair with a slight smile, someone who had worked with me years ago and seemed pleased by the news. And I saw Jessica Hartman sit completely still, her face carefully blank, though her knuckles had turned white around the pen she held. I continued. This restructuring has been in development for several months. 3 departments will now operate under a unified regional framework, which means new reporting structures, new accountability measures, and new standards for how we conduct ourselves both internally and with our clients. Over the next hour, I will walk you through these changes. But first, I want to establish something clearly. I paused and let my gaze move around the table, making eye contact with each person for just a moment. When I reached Jessica, I did not linger. I treated her exactly the same as everyone else. Professional, even, fair. Excellence in this organization will no longer be measured solely by numbers on a spreadsheet. Revenue matters. Performance metrics matter. But so does how we achieve those results. So does how we treat our colleagues. So does whether we build people up or tear them down. I want to be absolutely clear about this from day one. If you are someone who believes that your position gives you permission to disrespect others, to talk down to support staff, to treat people as obstacles instead of human beings, then you and I are going to have a very direct conversation about whether this is the right place for you. The room remained quiet. I saw several people nodding slowly, a woman near the end of the table, someone from the customer service, Division sat up a little straighter. I recognized her from her file. She had been with the company for 9 years, consistently received excellent reviews, but had also filed 2 complaints about hostile work environment that had been dismissed as personality conflicts. She was looking at me now like she was hearing something she had waited a long time to hear. Jessica shifted in her seat. She crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. She set down her pen and picked it up again. She was trying to appear unaffected, but I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out if this speech was about her, trying to decide if I had recognized her from Friday evening, trying to assess how much danger she was actually in. I moved forward with the presentation. I explained the new structure. I outlined the reporting changes. I discussed the timeline for implementation. I answered questions about territories and client assignments. I was thorough, clear, and focused. This was not personal. This was business. This was about building something better than what we had before. 40 minutes into the meeting, I reached the section about performance standards and conduct expectations. I brought up a slide on the screen behind me that listed the company's core values: respect, integrity, collaboration, excellence. They were words that had been on the website and in the employee handbook for years, but words that had not always translated into actual behavior. These are not suggestions, I said. These are requirements. And starting today, we will measure ourselves against them just as seriously as we measure sales figures. I have spent the weekend reviewing personnel files across all 3 departments. I have read performance reviews. I have read peer feedback. I have read incident reports. And I have seen patterns that concern me. I did not look at Jessica when I said this. I kept my eyes on the room as a whole, but I felt the temperature change. People were paying attention now in a different way. This was not just an administrative update. This was something more. In the coming weeks, I will be meeting individually with each person in this room and with key members of your teams. These will be conversations, not interrogations. I want to understand what is working, what is not working, and how we can do better. I also want to make it clear that if there are issues that have not been addressed, now is the time to bring them forward. My door will be open, not just literally, but genuinely. If you have experienced or witnessed behavior that contradicts our values, I want to know about it. A man across the table raised his hand. I recognized him as Thomas Brennan, a department head who had been with the company for 15 years. He had a reputation for being direct and fair. Dorothy, can you clarify what you mean by behavior that contradicts our values? Are we talking about major violations? Or are you also referring to smaller things that add up over time? It was a good question. An honest question. The kind that gave me an opening to be even more specific. Both, I said. Major violations, absolutely. But also the smaller things that create a culture where people do not feel valued. The dismissive comment in a meeting. The eye roll when someone asks a question. The way someone speaks to an assistant versus how they speak to a senior manager. The assumption that position equals worth. Those small things accumulate. They create environments where talented people leave, where collaboration becomes impossible, where we fail to live up to what we claim to be. Thomas nodded slowly. I appreciate that clarity. I think a lot of us have seen those smaller things get overlooked for too long. Other heads around the table nodded in agreement. I saw the woman from customer service lean forward slightly, her expression more engaged than before, and I saw Jessica Hartman, staring down at her portfolio like the words written there were suddenly the most important thing in the world. I wrapped up the formal presentation and opened the floor for additional questions. People asked about timelines, about budget allocations, about how the new structure would affect their teams. I answered each question directly. The meeting was professional, productive, and exactly what it needed to be. At 10:15, I concluded. Thank you all for your time and your attention. You will receive detailed emails this afternoon with next steps and scheduling for our individual meetings. I look forward to working with each of you. This is an opportunity to build something stronger together. Let's not waste it. People stood and began gathering their materials. Some approached me directly to introduce themselves or ask follow-up questions. I spent 10 minutes at the front of the room, shaking hands and making connections. Jessica Hartman did not approach. She left the room quickly, her portfolio clutched against her chest, her heels clicking rapidly as she disappeared down the hallway. I let her go. There would be time for that conversation, but not yet. Not until I had completed all the other meetings, until I had the full picture, until I could approach it with complete fairness, rather than emotion. Over the next 3 days, I conducted 17 individual meetings. I spoke with department heads, team leaders, and several staff members who had been flagged in various reports over the past year. I listened more than I talked. I asked questions. I took notes. And I began to see patterns emerge more clearly than they had appeared on paper. Jessica Hartman's name came up 5 times across different conversations. Not always directly. Sometimes it was a careful mention of someone who could be difficult to work with. Sometimes it was a more specific description of an incident. One woman, an administrative assistant named Claire, told me about a time when Jessica had snapped at her in front of clients for bringing the wrong type of water to a meeting. It had been sparkling instead of still, an honest mistake. But Jessica had made her feel incompetent and small. She apologized later, Claire said quietly. But it was the kind of apology that felt like she was doing me a favor, not like she actually meant it. And it kept happening. Little things. The way she would talk to me versus how she talked to the managers. Like I was just there to serve her instead of being part of the same team. I thanked Claire for her honesty and asked if there was anything else she wanted to share. She hesitated, then shook her head. I just want to feel like I matter, she said. Like my work matters even if I am not the one closing deals or making presentations. I have been here for 6 years. I show up every day. I do my job well. I just want to be treated with basic respect. That conversation stayed with me. So did the others. By Thursday afternoon, I had a clear understanding of the situation. Jessica Hartman was good at her job in terms of sales performance. She brought in clients. She met her targets. But she did so at a cost to the people around her. She created an environment where others felt diminished, where collaboration was difficult, where people chose to work around her rather than with her. It was not sustainable. It was not the kind of culture I intended to build, and it was time to address it directly. I scheduled a meeting with Jessica. For Friday afternoon, I sent the invitation through the official system, a simple calendar notice that read, Performance and Conduct Review, Conference Room C, 3:00 p.m. I copied Human Resources on the invitation, following proper protocol. This would be documented. This would be done correctly. When Friday arrived, I spent the morning preparing. I reviewed her file again. I reread the incident reports. I printed out the relevant company policies. I outlined the conversation in my notes, making sure I knew exactly what points I needed to cover and in what order. This was not about what had happened in the grocery store, though that moment had opened my eyes to something larger. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for too long. At 2:45, I walked to Conference Room C. It was a smaller space than the one we had used for the Monday morning meeting, with a round table that seated 6 and windows that looked out over the parking deck. I arranged my materials and waited. Jessica arrived at exactly 3:00. She knocked on the door even though it was open, a tentative gesture that surprised me. She looked different than she had on Monday. Her confidence had been replaced by something more guarded. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the high table. "Thank you for coming," I said. My tone was professional, neutral. I want to discuss your performance and some concerns that have been brought to my attention. She nodded slowly. Is this about the grocery store? Her directness caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. It saved us from dancing around the obvious. It is about a pattern of behavior, I said carefully. The grocery store incident made me aware of something I might not have noticed otherwise. But what we are going to discuss today is based on documented reports, peer feedback, and company policy, not on a personal encounter. I saw her shoulders relax slightly, though her expression remained tense. She had been expecting something more confrontational, more personal. She had been preparing to defend herself against an attack, but that was not what this was. I opened her file and turned it so she could see the pages. Over the past 18 months, you have received multiple reports about your conduct with colleagues and support staff. These reports describe incidents where your tone was dismissive, where you spoke to people in ways that made them feel disrespected, where you prioritized your own convenience over basic professional courtesy. She looked at the papers, but did not reach for them. I meet my sales targets. I bring in more revenue than most people in my division. My clients are satisfied. That is true, I said. Your sales performance is strong, but performance is not only about numbers. It is also about how you work within a team, how you treat the people who support you, how you contribute to or detract from a healthy work environment. She bristled slightly. So, you are saying that being nice is more important than doing my job well? I am saying that treating people with respect is part of doing your job well. It is not optional. It is not secondary. It is fundamental. A pause for a moment that needs to break before we continue with the final response to Jessica. I have read reports where you criticized a colleague's presentation in a meeting using language that was unprofessional. I have read feedback from support staff who feel uncomfortable working with you because of how you speak to them. I have documentation of 2 prior warnings about your tone in client communications. This is not about one incident. This is about a pattern that has been allowed to continue because your sales numbers were strong enough to overlook it. That ends now. Jessica's face flushed. People are too sensitive. Everyone gets feedback. Everyone gets criticized sometimes. That is how business works. There is a difference between constructive feedback and making someone feel worthless, I said evenly. There is a difference between high standards and cruelty, and there is a difference between being direct and being disrespectful. You have crossed those lines repeatedly. She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. So, what happens now? Are you firing me because of some complaints from people who cannot handle the pressure of a professional environment? I met her eyes directly. I am not firing you, not today, but I am putting you on formal notice. You have 60 days to demonstrate meaningful improvement in how you interact with colleagues across all levels of this organization. You will participate in professional development training focused on communication and leadership. You will meet with me bi-weekly to discuss your progress. And if there is another incident report during this period, we will be having a very different conversation about your future here. She stared at me for a long moment. I could see her processing, calculating, trying to decide how to respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Was it really that bad? What I said in the store? I considered my answer carefully. You looked at someone and decided their value based on their appearance. You spoke to them like they were an obstacle instead of a person. You used your position to make yourself feel superior. Yes, it was that bad. And the fact that you are asking suggests you genuinely do not understand the impact of your behavior. That is something we need to work on. She looked down at her hands. For the first time since entering the room, she seemed less defensive and more uncertain. I did not recognize you. I thought you were just someone in the way. That is exactly the problem, I said. You should not need to recognize someone to treat them with basic decency. Every person deserves respect regardless of what they are wearing, or where you encounter them, or what position they hold. That is the standard. That is what I expect. And that is what will be required if you want to continue working here. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes. We discussed the specific training she would complete, the timeline for our check-in meetings, the metrics we would use to assess improvement. I documented everything. I kept the conversation focused on behavior, policy, and expectations, rather than emotions or personal judgments. When Jessica left the conference room, she looked different than when she had arrived. Not defeated, but sobered. Like someone who had just realized that actions have consequences, that reputation matters, that the way we treat people when we think no one important is watching might be the most important measure of all. I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes after she left. I felt tired, but also clear. This had been the right thing to do, not because of what happened in the grocery store, but because of what that moment had revealed about a larger pattern that needed to be addressed. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Claire, the administrative assistant who had shared her experience with me earlier in the week. The message was brief. "Thank you for listening." I did not respond immediately. I just looked at those 3 words and felt something settle in my chest. This was why the work mattered. Not for revenge or vindication, but for the people who showed up every day and deserved to be treated with dignity. I gathered my materials and headed back to my office. There was still work to do, still conversations to have, still a culture to build. But for the first time since Friday evening in that grocery store, I felt like the weight I had been carrying was starting to lift. Not because I had won something, but because I had chosen not to let humiliation become the standard. Because I had decided that silence in one moment could lead to meaningful change in the next. A pause for a reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell us in the comments where you are listening to this story from. We will post new stories every day. Thank you. Let's continue. The weekend passed with an unusual quietness. I spent Saturday morning at the farmer's market on 7th Street, walking between stalls of fresh vegetables and homemade bread, letting the normalcy of the routine settle my mind. The vendors greeted me with familiar smiles. No one knew about the meeting on Friday. No one knew about the restructuring or the confrontations or the decisions that weighed on my thoughts. Here, I was just Dorothy, the woman who always bought tomatoes from the same farmer and asked about his grandchildren. Sunday, I drove out to Lake Norman and sat on a bench near the water. The surface reflected gray clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. I watched families walk past, children chasing each other along the shore, couples holding hands as they strolled. Ordinary life continuing all around me while my professional world shifted beneath my feet. I thought about the 60 days I had given Jessica Hartman. I thought about whether change was really possible, whether someone who had built patterns of behavior over years could genuinely transform in 2 months. Part of me doubted it. Part of me expected her to coast through the training, say the right things in our meetings, and then return to her old habits the moment she felt safe again. But another part of me, the part that had spent 11 years at this company watching people grow and evolve, held onto a thin thread of hope. People could change when they finally understood why they needed to. Sometimes it just took the right catalyst. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures warm enough that I left my jacket in the car. I arrived at the office at 7:30, earlier than most, and spent the first hour responding to emails and preparing for the week ahead. At 8:45, my assistant Marcus knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Dorothy, there is something you should know about. It happened this morning in the break room." I gestured for him to sit. Marcus had worked as my assistant for 3 years, long before this promotion. He was observant, discreet, and had an instinct for when information mattered. If he was bringing something to my attention, it was worth hearing. Jessica Hartman was in the break room around 8:15, he said. There were several people there getting coffee. From what I understand, she made a comment loud enough for others to hear. She said something about how the new leadership was more concerned with feelings than results, and that people who could not handle direct feedback should find easier jobs. I felt my jaw tighten. Who heard this? At least 4 people. Claire was one of them. She is the one who told me. She said Jessica was looking right at her when she said it. I leaned back in my chair and processed this information. It had been 3 days since our meeting. 3 days since I had outlined clear expectations about behavior and respect, and Jessica had already violated them, not privately, but publicly, in a way designed to undermine both the new standards and the people who had spoken up about her conduct. Thank you for telling me, Marcus. Can you ask Claire if she would be willing to write down exactly what was said, and who else was present? I need documentation. He nodded. She already started writing it down. She said she knew it needed to be reported, but she was nervous about coming directly to you. Tell her I appreciate her courage and that she did the right thing. Also, can you send Jessica a meeting invitation for this afternoon at 2? Conference. Room C again. Copy, HR. Marcus stood to leave, then paused at the door. Dorothy, people are watching how you handle this. The ones who have been dealing with behavior like hers for years, they are watching to see if the new standards actually mean something or if they are just words. I know, I said quietly. That is exactly why this matters. He left and I sat alone with the weight of what came next. This was the test. This was the moment where intentions either translated into action or dissolved into empty promises. Jessica had made her choice. Now I had to make mine. I spent the next 2 hours in back-to-back meetings about budget allocations and client strategies, forcing myself to stay focused on the work, even as part of my mind circled back to the break room incident. At noon, I received an email from Claire with a detailed account of what had happened. Her description was clear and specific. Jessica had stood near the coffee maker and spoken loud enough for everyone present to hear. Her exact words, according to Claire, were, "Apparently, we are supposed to worry more about hurt feelings than actual performance now. If people cannot handle honest feedback without running to file complaints, maybe they should look for work somewhere with lower standards." 3 other people had been copied. On Claire's email, each confirming they had witnessed the same incident. One of them, a manager named Robert Chen, added his own note. This kind of comment creates a hostile environment for anyone who has raised legitimate concerns about workplace conduct. It also directly contradicts the standards you outlined in last week's meeting. I printed the emails and added them to Jessica's file. Then I called the HR director, a woman named Patricia Vance, who had been with the company for 20 years. Patricia had sat in on Friday's meeting with Jessica and was already familiar with the situation. "Patricia, we have a problem. Jessica made comments this morning that directly violate the expectations we established. I am meeting with her at 2. I need you there." "What kind of comments?" Patricia's voice was calm but alert. I read her the documentation. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That is pretty blatant," Patricia said, "especially 3 days after a formal conduct review. It suggests either she does not take the expectations seriously or she is actively trying to undermine them. That is my assessment as well. I want to be fair, but I also need to send a clear message that this behavior will not be tolerated. What are my options?" We spent 20 minutes discussing the situation. Patricia outlined the disciplinary procedures, the documentation requirements, the legal considerations. By the end of the call, I knew what I needed to do. It was not what I had hoped would be necessary, but Jessica had made the choice for me. At 1:45, I walked to conference room C. Patricia was already there, her own file of documents spread on the table. We reviewed the plan one more time, making sure we were aligned on every point. At precisely 2 o'clock, Jessica arrived. She looked different today. Her posture was defensive from the moment she entered the room. She saw Patricia, and her expression hardened further. She knew this was not going to be a routine check-in. "Please sit down, Jessica," I said. My voice was level, professional. I felt no satisfaction in this moment, only a sad certainty about what needed to happen. She sat and crossed her arms. "I assume this is about the break room." "It is," I confirmed. "Less than 72 hours after we discussed expectations for your conduct, you made public comments that directly contradicted those expectations and created a hostile environment for colleagues who have raised legitimate concerns." "I was expressing an opinion," she said sharply. "Last time I checked, people were still allowed to have opinions, though. You were making targeted comments designed to intimidate people who reported your behavior," I corrected. "There is a difference between expressing an opinion and creating an environment where people feel unsafe raising concerns. You know that difference, Jessica, and you chose to cross that line anyway." Patricia leaned forward. "We have written statements from 4 witnesses confirming what was said and the context in which it was said. This is documented." Jessica's face flushed. "So people can say whatever they want about me, but I cannot defend myself." "You can defend yourself in appropriate settings through appropriate channels," I said. What you cannot do is make comments in public spaces that are clearly intended to punish or intimidate people for reporting conduct violations. That is retaliation, and it is grounds for immediate disciplinary action. She stared at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, not quite understanding, but maybe the beginning of it, the realization that this was real, that consequences were actually coming, that she could not talk or perform her way out of this. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Immediate disciplinary action?" I opened the folder in front of me. Given that this incident occurred during the 60-day performance improvement period we established on Friday, and given that it directly violates the core expectation we discussed, we are escalating the disciplinary process. You are being placed on a 30-day unpaid suspension. During that time, you will not have access to company systems or facilities. You will not contact clients or colleagues. You will use that time to seriously consider whether you are willing and able to meet the standards required to continue working here. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked between me and Patricia, as if waiting for one of us to indicate this was not real. "If you choose to return after the suspension," I continued, "you will be on a final warning. Any additional conduct violations will result in immediate termination. You will also complete mandatory training on professional conduct and workplace. Respect before you resume your duties. This is not negotiable. 30 days without pay." Her voice cracked slightly. "I have bills. I have a mortgage. You cannot just take away my income for having an opinion." "This is not about an opinion," Patricia said firmly. "This is about behavior that violates company policy and creates liability for the organization. The suspension is appropriate and proportional to the violation. You are receiving documentation of this decision in writing within the hour, along with information about your rights and the appeals process." Jessica stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor. "This is because of the grocery store. You recognized me, and you have been waiting for an excuse to punish me." I remained seated, my hands folded calmly on the table. The grocery store made me aware of behavior patterns that were already documented in your file. Those patterns predated our encounter by more than a year. What happened in the break room this morning would have resulted in the same response regardless of our personal history. You were given clear expectations. You violated them publicly and deliberately. These are the consequences. She grabbed her bag, her hands shaking with anger or fear or both. "I will fight this. I will go to a lawyer. You cannot, just destroy someone's career because they hurt your feelings. You are not being asked to leave permanently," I said quietly. "You are being given 30 days to decide if you want to be part of an organization that values respect alongside results. That is your choice to make, but the choice is yours, Jessica, not mine." She stared at me for another moment, then turned and walked out without another word. The door closed behind her. With more force than necessary, Patricia and I sat in silence for several seconds. "That was harder than I expected," Patricia said finally. "It needed to happen," I replied. "But yes, it was hard." We spent the next 30 minutes finalizing paperwork and documentation. Patricia would handle the formal notification and escort Jessica from the building if necessary. I would send a carefully worded email to the relevant teams, explaining that Jessica would be on leave for the next 30 days and outlining interim coverage for her accounts. By 4 o'clock, it was done. Jessica had been escorted to her desk to collect personal items, then left the building. The security badge that had swung from her neck in that grocery store had been deactivated. The office that had displayed her sales awards was locked. The career she had built on strong numbers and weak character had been suspended, waiting to see if she could rebuild it differently. I returned to my office and closed the door. I stood by the window looking out at the city, at the traffic moving below, at people going about their lives unaware of the small drama that had just unfolded on the 8th floor. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, and I saw exhaustion in my own eyes. Marcus knocked softly and entered with a cup of tea. He set it on my desk without saying anything, just offered a small nod of understanding before leaving again. I picked up the cup and let the warmth seep into my hands. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Claire again. "I heard what happened. Thank you for taking it seriously. It means more than you know." I set down the tea and typed a response. "Thank you for having the courage to speak up. That is what makes change possible." As I sent the message, I thought about the grocery store again. I thought about the moment when Jessica's cart had slammed into my hip, when her words had cut through the aisle, when I had stood there deciding how to respond. I had chosen silence then, not weakness, but strategy. I had chosen to wait, to understand, to respond with clarity rather than emotion. And now, a week later, the consequences of that moment had rippled outward. Jessica was suspended, facing a real reckoning with her own behavior. Claire and others who had endured similar treatment for years were seeing that their experiences mattered, that speaking up could lead to real change. The entire organization was learning that the new standards were not just words in a presentation, but actual expectations with actual consequences. But there was something else too, something that settled in my chest as I stood by that window. I realized that this was not really about Jessica at all. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small by someone who thought position gave them permission to be cruel. It was about creating a workplace where people like Claire could come to work without bracing themselves for humiliation. It was about proving that respect was not optional, not secondary, not something we only extended to people we considered important. The bruise on my hip had faded to a yellowish green. In another few days, it would be gone completely, but the lesson would remain, not in bitterness or anger, but in the clear-eyed understanding that how we treat people when we think no one important is watching is the truest measure of our character. And sometimes, the person watching turns out to be more important than we realized, not because of their title or position, but because they have the power to decide whether bad behavior will continue unchecked or whether it will finally meet the consequences it always should have. I finished my tea and returned to my desk. There were emails to answer, reports to review, a dozen other tasks that required attention. But first, I took a moment to write one more message. This one was to Thomas Brennan, the department head who had asked the thoughtful question in last week's meeting. Thomas, I wanted you to know that we had a significant conduct issue today that required immediate action. I am sharing this with you because I know your team works closely with the person involved, and I want to be transparent about why there will be changes in account coverage. If you have questions or concerns, my door is open. His response came back within 5 minutes. I appreciate the transparency. Several of us have been hoping for exactly this kind of accountability. It is overdue, and I am glad to see leadership taking it seriously. Whatever support you need from our team, you have it. I read his message twice, then closed my laptop and allowed myself a small, tired smile. Change was messy. Change was uncomfortable. Change required difficult conversations and harder decisions. But change was also necessary. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like real change was actually possible. The sun was setting outside my window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I gathered my things and prepared to head home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new decisions. But tonight, I would rest knowing that the culture I wanted to build was beginning to take shape. Not perfectly, not easily, but genuinely. And that was enough. The 30 days passed more quickly than I expected. March gave way to April, and with it came warmer weather and the kind of light that made Charlotte feel alive again. Trees along the streets downtown bloomed with white and pink flowers. People ate lunch outside on benches. The city shed its winter heaviness and moved into spring with renewed energy. At the office, the changes I had initiated began to settle into routine. The individual meetings I had scheduled were completed. I had spoken with every department head, every team leader, and dozens of staff members across the 3 divisions now under my oversight. What emerged from those conversations was both encouraging and sobering. People were hungry for the kind of leadership that valued them as whole human beings rather than just productivity units. They wanted to be seen. They wanted their contributions to matter beyond spreadsheets and metrics. But they were also cautious. Years of disappointment had taught them to wait and see whether new promises would actually materialize into lasting change. I understood their hesitance. Trust was not built through announcements and policies. It was built through consistent action over time, through following through on commitments, through proving that words matched reality. Claire had blossomed in ways that surprised even me. After Jessica's suspension, she had approached me about taking on additional responsibilities. She wanted to move beyond administrative work and develop skills in project coordination. I connected her with Thomas Brennan's team, and within 2 weeks she was managing logistics for a major client pitch that had previously been handled by someone at twice her salary. She was good at it, better than good. She brought attention to detail and genuine care about outcomes that elevated the entire project. I never thought anyone would take me seriously, she told me during one of our check-in meetings. I have been doing admin work for 6 years, and I started to believe that was all I was capable of. But you asked me what I wanted to do, not just what I was currently doing. No one had ever asked me that before. Her words stayed with me. How many talented people had we overlooked simply because we never bothered to ask what they were capable of beyond their current role? How much potential had we wasted because we made assumptions based on job titles rather than actual abilities? Robert Chen, the manager who had witnessed and documented the break room incident, had become an informal ally in the culture shift. He started a voluntary mentorship program connecting senior staff with newer employees who wanted to develop leadership skills. The response exceeded expectations. Within 3 weeks, 23 mentorship pairs had formed across departments. People were investing in each other's growth, creating connections that transcended the formal hierarchy. But not everyone embraced the changes. There was resistance, sometimes subtle and sometimes overt. A few managers who had operated under the old model where results justified any behavior found themselves uncomfortable in an environment where accountability applied to everyone. 2 of them requested transfers to other divisions. One left the company entirely, claiming in his exit interview that the new standards were making it impossible to maintain high performance. I let them go without trying to convince them to stay. If someone believed that respect and results were mutually exclusive, they were not the kind of leader I wanted building teams anyway. Jessica's absence created a vacuum that was filled more easily than I anticipated. Her accounts were redistributed among 3 other sales professionals who had been performing well, but had been overshadowed by her aggressive approach. Without her dominating presence, they thrived. Client relationships that I had assumed were dependent on. Jessica turned out to be stronger with representatives who listened more and bulldozed less. 2 clients even commented to their account managers that they appreciated the shift in how they were being served. It was a quiet lesson in how much damage one person's behavior could inflict on an entire ecosystem, and how much healing could happen when that damage was finally addressed. As the suspension period neared its end, I began receiving questions about whether Jessica would return. I had not heard from her directly. She had not appealed the suspension or reached out to HR. Patricia Vance told me that silence was not unusual. People facing consequences often needed time to process before they were ready to engage again. Some of them used the time for genuine reflection, Patricia said during one of our weekly meetings. Others just waited out and come back unchanged. You will know which category she falls into pretty quickly once she returns. On the 28th day of the suspension, I received an email from Jessica. It was brief and formal, sent late in the evening on a Wednesday. The subject line read, "Request for return meeting." The body of the email contained 4 sentences. I would like to schedule a meeting to discuss my return to work. I have completed the required training modules. I understand the expectations that have been outlined. I am prepared to move forward professionally. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the specific behaviors that had led to the suspension, just a statement of compliance with the technical requirements. I read it twice, trying to discern intention from the carefully neutral language. Then I forwarded it to Patricia with a note. "What do you think?" Her response came within an hour. That standard approach for someone who wants to come back but is not ready to admit real wrongdoing. The question is whether you think she can change her behavior even without fully owning what she did wrong. Some people can, others just get better at hiding it. I scheduled the meeting for the following Monday, 2 days after her official return date. I wanted to give her the weekend to settle back in, to see how she approached her first days back in the office before we had a formal conversation. Sometimes behavior revealed more than words ever could. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably cool temperatures and rain that drummed steadily against the office windows. I arrived early as usual and spent the first hour reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for a budget meeting scheduled for later in the week. At 8:15, Marcus knocked on my door. "Jessica is here," he said quietly. "She came in about 20 minutes ago. Went straight to her office. She has been in there with the door closed ever since." "How did she seem?" He considered the question. Subdued. She did not make eye contact with anyone in the hallway, just walked in with her head down and closed the door. Okay. Let me know if anything notable happens before our meeting this afternoon. The morning passed in the rhythm of normal work, meetings, emails, decisions about staffing and resources. I was in a conference call with the West Coast office when Marcus sent me a text. You should know that Jessica just went to the break room. Claire and 2 others were there. She poured her coffee and left without speaking to anyone. I read the message and felt a flicker of something that might have been disappointment or might have been unsurprised confirmation. She was avoiding Sash, not engaging, hiding rather than addressing the situation directly. It was not a promising sign. At 2 o'clock, I walked to conference room C for what felt like the 100th time in the past month. This room had become the site of so many difficult conversations. So many moments where choices were made about what kind of workplace we would build together. Patricia was already there, as was Michael Ross, Jessica's direct supervisor who had been copied on all the documentation and kept informed throughout the process. Jessica arrived exactly on time. She wore a dark blue suit and minimal jewelry. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style. She looked professional and composed, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not quite vulnerability, but maybe wariness. The confidence that had carried her through our previous meetings had been replaced by something more careful, more calculated. Thank you for meeting with us, Jessica, I began. Before we discuss the logistics of your return, I want to understand where you are mentally and emotionally with regard to the expectations we outlined and the reasons for your suspension. She nodded slowly. I completed all the required training modules. I reviewed the company policies on workplace conduct. I understand that my behavior needs to meet certain standards. It was a rehearsed response, delivered with the flatness of someone reciting memorized lines. I let the silence stretch for a moment, waiting to see if she would add anything more genuine. She did not. Understanding the standards intellectually is one thing, I said. Being able to actually implement them in daily interactions is another. Can you tell me specifically what you have learned about your own behavior and how you plan to change it? Another pause. She glanced at Michael, then back at me. I recognize that I can be direct in my communication style. Some people interpreted that as harsh or dismissive. Moving forward, I will be more mindful of how my words might be received. It was still surface level, still deflecting responsibility onto other people's interpretations, rather than owning the impact of her actions. But there was something else beneath the words, something I could not quite name. She was trying, even if she did not fully understand what she was trying to do yet. Michael leaned forward. Jessica, I want to be very clear about what your return looks like. You will not immediately resume all of your previous accounts. You will work with a reduced portfolio while we assess how you handle interactions with clients and colleagues. You will have weekly check-ins with me to discuss not just your sales metrics, but also feedback from people you work with. And any conduct complaints during this period will result in immediate termination. Do you understand these conditions? I understand, she said quietly. Do you accept them? I asked. She met my eyes then, and for the first time I saw something that looked like actual emotion beneath the careful composure. I do not have much choice, do I? You always have a choice, I replied. You can accept these conditions and try to rebuild your reputation here. Or you can decide that this is not the right environment for you and look for opportunities elsewhere. Both are legitimate options. But what you cannot do is come back and continue the patterns that led to your suspension. That choice is not available. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller. I need this job. I have financial obligations. I cannot just walk away. It was the first truly honest thing she had said in the meeting. Not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but at least an admission of vulnerability. It was something. Then let's talk about how to make your return successful, Patricia said, her tone shifting to something more practical and less confrontational. You have been assigned a modified schedule for the first 2 weeks. You will work primarily on internal projects and client documentation, rather than face-to-face client interactions. This gives you time to readjust, and gives us time to observe how you engage with colleagues in lower-stakes situations. We spent the next 30 minutes outlining the specific parameters of her return, the reduced account load, the weekly check-ins, the documentation process, the the clear benchmarks she would need to meet. Jessica listened and took notes, asking occasional clarifying questions, but offering little in the way of pushback or resistance. She had become compliant, which was not the same as transformed, but was at least better than defiant. As the meeting concluded, I made one final point. Jessica, I want you to succeed here. I genuinely do, but success in this environment requires more than just meeting sales targets. It requires treating people well, building trust, contributing to a culture where everyone can do their best work. If you can do that, there is a place for you here. If you cannot, then we will both know relatively quickly that it is time to part ways. Fair enough? She nodded. Fair enough. She stood and gathered her things. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back. For a moment, I thought she might say something significant, might offer the genuine acknowledgement that had been missing from the entire conversation. But instead, she just said, "Thank you for giving me another chance," and left. The three of us sat in silence after she had gone. "Well," Michael said eventually, "that was not exactly inspiring." "No," I agreed, "but it was not hostile either. She is cooperating, even if she is not fully embracing the changes yet. That is something." Patricia gathered her files. "The next few weeks will tell us everything we need to know. Either she will genuinely work on changing her behavior, or she will coast through the minimum requirements while resenting every moment of it. My money is honestly on the latter, but I have been surprised before." After they left, I remained in the conference room for a few extra minutes. I thought about Jessica's face when she had admitted she needed the job, when the mask of confidence had slipped just enough to reveal the person underneath. I thought about whether financial necessity could be enough motivation for genuine behavior change, or whether real transformation required deeper understanding. I did not have answers. I just had hope, tempered by realism, that perhaps this suspension had created enough disruption in her life to make her willing to try something different. Time would reveal whether that hope had any foundation. A pause to remind you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are listening to this story from. We will post new stories every day. Thank you. Let's continue. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Jessica carefully without making it obvious. She arrived on time each day. She completed her assigned tasks. She attended team meetings and contributed when asked, but did not dominate conversations the way she used to. She was quieter, more contained, like someone walking on ice and testing each step before committing their full weight. Claire reported that Jessica had nodded to her in the hallway one morning, a small gesture, but more acknowledgement than she had ever received before. Robert Chen mentioned that Jessica had asked his opinion on a client strategy during a meeting instead of simply announcing her own approach. These were tiny shifts, barely noticeable individually, but collectively, they suggested someone who was at least trying to operate differently. But there was also something missing. An authenticity, a sense that the changes came from internal conviction rather than external pressure. She was performing the behaviors required of her, but it felt like exactly that, a performance, something she was doing because she had to, not because she understood why it mattered. Still, performance was better than defiance, and maybe over time, performed behaviors could become genuine habits. Maybe acting respectful could eventually lead to actually feeling respect for others. I had seen it happen before with other employees who had started from a place of compliance and gradually shifted toward authentic change. Or maybe Patricia was right, and Jessica was just waiting for enough time to pass that she could return to her old patterns once the scrutiny eased. Only time would tell. What I knew for certain was that the grocery store incident that had started all of this felt very far away now. That moment of humiliation had been painful and sharp, but it had also been clarifying. It had opened my eyes to patterns I might have otherwise missed. It had given me the resolve to address behaviors that had been tolerated for too long. It had reminded me that leadership was not just about strategy and results, but about creating environments where people could thrive without fear of being diminished. The bruise on my hip was long gone. The memory remained, but it had transformed from something raw into something more like steel, a reminder of strength, of choosing not to accept humiliation as acceptable. of using power not for revenge but for creating something better. And as I watched Jessica navigate her tentative return, as I saw the culture shift taking root across the departments I led, as I heard from people like Claire who were finally feeling valued and seen, I understood that the real victory was not in any individual consequence or any single changed behavior. The real victory was in proving that dignity mattered, that respect was non-negotiable, that the way we treated people when we thought no one important was watching defined who we were more than any quarterly earnings report ever could. Jessica would either rise to meet these standards or she would not. That was ultimately her choice to make. But either way, the standard itself would remain. And that made all the difference. 6 weeks after Jessica's return, I stood in the same conference room where so many pivotal conversations had taken place and looked out at a completely different scene. The table was filled not with tension and difficult confrontations, but with the quarterly review meeting I had been preparing for since taking this position. Department heads sat with relaxed postures, smiling as they discussed results that exceeded expectations across nearly every metric. Revenue was up, client satisfaction scores had improved, and perhaps most significantly, employee retention had stabilized after years of steady decline. Thomas Brennan was presenting data on team performance when he paused and looked directly at me. I want to note something that does not show up clearly in these numbers but matters tremendously. We have had 0 conduct complaints filed in the past 6 weeks. 0. For context, in the same period last year, we averaged 4 to 5 complaints per month. That shift represents a fundamental change in how people are experiencing this workplace. Heads nodded around the table. Patricia Vance added, "Our exit interview data supports that observation. People who are leaving are doing so for normal reasons like relocation or career changes, not because of hostile work environments. That is a significant indicator of cultural health." I felt something warm settle in my chest. These were the outcomes that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. These were the signs that respect and results could coexist, that treating people well actually improved performance rather than hindering it. After the meeting concluded, I returned to my office to find Marcus, waiting with an unusual expression on his face. "You have a visitor," he said. "Jessica Hartman asked if she could speak with you. She does not have an appointment, but she said it was important." I glanced at my calendar. I had 30 minutes before my next meeting. "Send her in." Jessica entered my office with a nervousness I had not seen before. She was not wearing her usual armor of confidence. She looked younger somehow, more uncertain. She stood near the door until I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for seeing me without notice," she began, her hands twisted together in her lap. "I know you are busy. I will not take much of your time. What can I do for you, Jessica?" She took a breath and met my eyes. "I need to say something that I should have said weeks ago. Months ago, really. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind I have been offering where I apologize for how people interpreted my words, but an actual acknowledgement that my behavior was wrong." I stayed quiet, giving her space to continue. "When I saw you at the grocery store that night, I made a judgment about your worth based on how you looked. I decided you did not matter because you were not dressed like someone important. I was cruel because I thought I could be, because I assumed there would be no consequences for treating someone that way. And I was wrong. Not just because you turned out to be someone who could hold me accountable, but because it was wrong regardless of who you were or what position you held." Her voice cracked slightly. She paused to compose herself before continuing. "The suspension gave me time to think about things I had been avoiding for years, about how I treated people, about why I felt like I needed to make others feel small in order to feel big myself, about the difference between being direct and being cruel. I completed the training modules, but honestly, that was not what changed things for me. What changed things was having to sit at home for 30 days knowing that my career was hanging by a thread because of choices I made, because of a pattern I created and maintained." She looked down at her hands. "I have been back for 6 weeks now, and every day I have to consciously choose to behave differently than I used to. It does not come naturally yet. I still have moments where my first instinct is to snap at someone or dismiss their input or make myself feel superior by making them feel inferior, but I am catching those moments now instead of just acting on them. and I am starting to see that the person I was being was not someone I actually wanted to be. I watched her carefully, listening not just to her words but to the tone beneath them. This was different from the rehearsed compliance she had offered in our previous meetings. This felt genuine. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I almost quit last week," she said quietly. "I had my resignation letter written. I was going to send it and just walk away, rather than keep trying to change something that felt so hard. But then something happened that made me reconsider." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Claire, the administrative assistant I used to treat terribly, brought me coffee during a client meeting last Tuesday. She did not have to. It was not part of her responsibilities. But she noticed I was having a rough day, and she brought me coffee with a note that said she hoped things got better. After everything I put her through, after all the times I made her feel worthless, she chose kindness." Jessica's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That gesture broke something in me, or maybe it fixed something. I realized that the person I had been would never have received that kind of kindness, because I had never earned it. And I realized that building a reputation based on fear and intimidation had left me completely alone. When I was suspended, not one colleague reached out, not one person checked to see if I was okay, because I had spent years making sure no one cared about me beyond what I could produce. She unfolded the paper and showed it to me. It was indeed a resignation letter, dated from the previous week, professional and brief. "I did not send it," she continued, "because I decided I wanted to try something I have never tried before. I want to build relationships, based on respect instead of fear. I want to be someone that people like Claire would bring coffee to not out of duty, but because they genuinely care. I want to prove that I can change, not just perform the behaviors required of me, but actually become a different kind of professional." She refolded the letter and put it back in her bag. "I am telling you this because I owe you honesty. You gave me a second chance when you could have just let me go. You held me accountable when it would have been easier to ignore the pattern. And you did it in a way that was firm but not vindictive, that was professional, even when I gave you every reason to make it personal. That meant something. It still means something." I felt a tightness in my throat. This was the moment I had hoped for, but had not been sure would come. The moment when consequence transformed into genuine understanding. When external accountability became internal motivation. "Thank you for telling me this, Jessica," I said. "And thank you for the apology. I accept it. Not because it erases what happened, but because I believe in people's capacity to grow and change when they are willing to do the hard work." She nodded, wiping at her eyes quickly. "I know I have a long way to go. I know 6 weeks of better behavior does not undo years of bad behavior, but I am committed to the process, and I wanted you to know that. I appreciate that commitment," I said, "and I want you to know that I see the effort you are making. The team has noticed too. Change is hard, especially when it requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The fact that you are willing to do that work says something important about your character." We talked for a few more minutes about her, current projects and her goals for the coming months. The conversation was different from any we had before. There was no defensiveness, no hidden agendas, just honest communication between two professionals trying to navigate a complicated situation with integrity. After she left, I sat alone in my office and thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with a moment of humiliation in a grocery store aisle, with a shopping cart striking my hip and words designed to make me feel worthless. It had moved through difficult decisions and uncomfortable confrontations, through documentation and consequences, through resistance and gradual change. And now it had arrived here, not at a perfect ending where everything was resolved and everyone lived happily ever after, but at a realistic place where growth was happening, where culture was shifting, where people were learning that respect and results were not opposing forces but complementary elements of sustainable success. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Did Jessica come talk to you? She told me she was going to apologize. I hope it went okay." I smiled and typed back, "It went well. Thank you for the kindness you showed her. That made a difference." Her response came quickly. "We all deserve chances to be better than we have been, even people who have hurt us." I read her words twice, feeling the wisdom in them. Claire, who had endured so much dismissive treatment, who had been made to feel small and insignificant, had chosen to respond with grace rather than resentment. She had offered coffee, and a kind note to someone who had never shown her kindness in return, and in doing so, she had catalyzed a transformation that consequences alone might not have achieved. That evening, I left the office as the sun was setting, painting the Charlotte skyline in shades of gold and amber. I drove home through familiar streets, past the Harris Teeter where everything had started, and felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The grocery store incident had been painful. It had exposed something ugly about how easily people could decide another person's value based on superficial judgments. But it had also revealed an opportunity to create something better, to use authority not for personal satisfaction, but for cultural transformation. Jessica would continue to grow, or she would not. That was ultimately her choice and her responsibility. But either way, the standard had been set. The expectation was clear. In this workplace, people would be valued not just for what they produced, but for, how they treated others along the way. Respect was not optional, dignity was not negotiable, and appearance did not determine worth. I pulled into my parking space and sat in the car for a moment, engine off, letting the evening quiet settle around me. My phone buzzed one more time. It was an email from Thomas Brennan with the subject line, "Quarterly results and a personal note." I opened it and read, "Dorothy, the numbers speak for themselves, but I wanted to add something personal. When you took this position, many of us were cautiously hopeful that things might change. We had seen too many leaders talk about culture and values without backing it up with action. You have been different. You have shown us that holding people accountable and treating them with dignity are not contradictory goals. You have created an environment where people like Claire can thrive and people like Jessica can transform. That is leadership. Thank you for bringing it to our organization." I closed my eyes and felt tears prick at the corners. Leadership was lonely sometimes. It required making decisions that were unpopular, having conversations that were uncomfortable, holding standards that others might resist. But it also created moments like this, moments where the hard work mattered, where the choices added up to something meaningful, where dignity was restored and potential was unlocked. The following Monday, I walked into the office wearing jeans and an old sweater, dressed for a casual day where I planned to work mostly from my office on strategic planning. As I passed through the lobby, I saw Jessica waiting for the elevator. She was dressed professionally as always, her company badge visible on its lanyard. Our eyes met. For a brief second, and I saw recognition flicker across her face, a memory perhaps of another time when she had judged someone by their clothes. But instead of the contempt she had shown that evening in the grocery store, I saw something different. She smiled, a small, genuine smile, and then she spoke. "Good morning, Dorothy." 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of transformation, the acknowledgement that what mattered was not how someone was dressed, but how they treated each other, not what position they held, but what character they displayed. "Good morning, Jessica," I replied. We stepped into the elevator together, 2 professionals heading to another day of work, carrying between us the history of what had been and the possibility of what could still become. The doors closed and the elevator rose, carrying us upward into another week, another opportunity, another chance to prove that respect and results could coexist, that people could change when given both accountability and grace, that dignity mattered more than any quarterly earnings report ever would. And as I stood in that elevator, dressed simply and comfortably, I thought about the woman I had been that Friday evening in the grocery store, exhausted, invisible, judged, humiliated. I thought about the choice I had made to respond not with immediate confrontation, but with strategic clarity. I thought about the silence that had felt like weakness in that moment, but had actually been strength. Sometimes the quietest response becomes the loudest lesson. Sometimes waiting for the right moment matters more than reacting in the heat of anger. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but the steady work of building something better than what existed before. The elevator. Doors opened on the 8th floor. Jessica stepped out first, then held the door for me with a small gesture of courtesy. We walked together down the hallway toward our respective offices, 2 women who had met in conflict and were learning, slowly and imperfectly, to exist in collaboration instead. Behind us, the doors closed. Ahead of us, the workday waited. And between those 2 points lived all the possibility of human transformation, all the potential for growth and change, all the hope that dignity could be restored, and cultures could shift, and people could become better versions of themselves when someone cared enough to hold them accountable with both firmness and grace. I reached my office, hung up my bag, and sat down at my desk. The bruise was long gone. The memory remained, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a foundation, a reminder that how we treat people when we think no one important is watching defines who we are more truly than any performance review or sales target ever could. And as I opened my laptop and began the day's work, I carried with me the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept humiliation as the standard, refuse to let cruelty go unchallenged, and choose instead to build workplaces and communities where every person matters, where dignity is protected, and where transformation remains always, impossibly, hopefully possible. The story that began with a shopping cart striking my hip in a fluorescent-lit grocery store aisle had led me here, to this desk, this role, this opportunity to shape culture and impact lives. It had not been the path I expected, but it had been exactly the path I needed, and that was enough.